Rebecca?
Yep. Okay, we will call the Human Resource Committee to order and call the roll. We have Brian, Joan, me, we're here.
We're all here.
We're all here. And I did not receive any public comments. Did you? No, you didn't either?
No.
And do we have an approval of the agenda, please?
So moved.
Second.
All right. Is this the part you want to take over, Brian?
Yeah, actually, I think, well, first I'm going to flip it to Steve, who obviously we're all super excited to have back in person with us. I think much of what we'll probably center our discussion on today is painted by a little bit of what's happening with the state budget and how that could affect us, or what effects that's having on us at this time. So, Steve, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you maybe to lead us into the supplemental pay discussion with some budgetary pictures.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm just going to go back a few months to just kind of talk a little bit about what we were doing for planning and kind of where we're at today, to just lay the groundwork a little bit for the discussion that we're going to have on teacher compensation scenarios. So back in the March timeframe, obviously this is a state budget year, right? So as a school district, we're trying to plan for the next fiscal year without really knowing the parameters of what resources we're going to have to work with. So Diane Pertzborn, who was in helping when I was out, and I were working on putting together some options and discussing them with the folks that help us project this information out. And Diane presented a couple of different scenarios to the budget committee. The governor had proposed an increase of $200 per student through the revenue limit formula. And so what Diane did was present, well, what would 150 a student look like, and what would 100 a student look like? After discussion, the consensus was to move ahead with a budget planning process based on $150 a student, thinking that that is conservative from what the governor was seeking for schools, knowing that there might be a legislative process that might pull that number back a bit. So since that period of time, we've been planning around, an estimated increase in revenues about $150 a student. So the first draft of the budget includes that planning process. The second draft includes that. We did talk with the budget committee at the last meeting that the Joint Finance Committee, there appeared to have been a process where there was a lot of discussion about the federal money that was coming into Wisconsin. And there were a lot of comments made that the state does not have to kick in money to public schools because there's all this federal money coming in. Then the discussion centered around, well, the state has to kick some money in because there's federal requirements called maintenance of effort that the state has to at least continue maintaining the level of commitment that was being made before. So there's a lot of dialogue around, do we have to contribute more money to schools from state funding versus federal funding? The challenge that I believe most school folks were trying to explain to their legislators is that federal funding that was coming to Wisconsin was for a very specific purpose, which was really around the pandemic. Under no circumstance were the federal funds that were coming into Wisconsin to be used for operational pay increases or running your school buses or paying for utilities. So even though there were legislators saying there's significant increases in money coming, pointing to spreadsheets and saying, look at what Madison's receiving, look at what Milwaukee's receiving, the challenge is those districts, just like our district, can't turn around and use that money on compensation increases. Well, in the end, the Joint Finance Committee approved a budget that had a very small increase in state support for schools. There was then discussion about that's not going to meet the federal maintenance of effort. If you remember, then there was a report that the state has like $4 billion more than what anybody was expecting. The Joint Finance Committee then took another look at it and said, okay, let's address the federal maintenance of effort thing right now because we have this additional money. They put 400+ million more into the state equalization aid formula. But the key, and I think it's important for everybody just to know the difference, is when that 400 million and the other funds were put into the school aid formula, the revenue limit formula in the budget was 0. And so what that means to school districts is the state could put $5 billion into the equalization aid formula, but if the revenue limit formula changes to 0, that means we can't spend any of it. Because under the revenue limit formula, all of our sources of funding is either property taxes or state aid. But if the revenue limit doesn't go up in any manner, we can't spend any of the money that's coming to us. So that's confusing, especially to members of the general public, right? So they might read that the aid estimate for Waunakee schools has increased by X amount of money and think, well, Waunakee schools can then spend that money.
So
But
Steve,
we
is
can't.
that where I read in the paper last week that Waunakee was going to receive $2 million in new money? That's where that's coming from.
Right, great question. So what Joan's referring to is last week, the Department of Public Instruction released what's called a July 1st equalization aid estimate. They do that every year. They give schools basically a little bit of a heads up as to what to expect in the fall for what the state is going to be contributing towards the school district funding. So the DPI came out with that last week. That was based on the Joint Finance Committee's decision to give those additional funds.
But not under the revenue.
But not under, so basically for members of the public who would read that, and it was certainly advertised in the paper that it came out on July 1st, you could draw the conclusion very easily. There's 400+ million additional money going into schools. That translates to X of an increase in the state equalization aid. Well, then the school district can spend that. But under this overarching formula called the revenue limit formula, if that goes up 0, in total, what we end up with state aid and property taxes balances each other out, but the total spending per student can't go up. Now, if we have 100 more students, that changes the revenue limit formula a little bit because we'd be able to spend some additional money based on those students. But I think a lot of individuals have just a common reaction to reading something like that and saying, oh, the school district's going to receive that plus federal money. There's a lot of funding going into schools, might be the way someone would look at that. In reality, we're not able to spend that state equalization aid funding because the revenue limit went up 0. And on the federal funding side, we all know that the Joint Finance Committee changed that process to have it be based on reportable in-person hours, which we've talked about disadvantages those districts that were under county health orders that we needed to follow. So we've got somewhat of a double whammy that the revenue limit is 0 and the federal funds for our district are likely going to be on the smaller side compared to other districts. But in total right now, what school districts are faced with is a revenue limit increase of 0, funding going into the equalization aid formula, which is typically going to drop property taxes, and then federal funding, in our case, based on ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 on in-person hours. Go ahead.
Can I ask one more question
Yeah.
on that article I read about Waunakee receiving $2 million in new money, but then there were a number of districts that were decreasing. Why would they be decreasing?
That's a great question. One of the other challenges when the legislature puts money into the Equalization Aid formula intending to have property tax relief is every district's place in that formula is different. There are districts who, like us, we're increasing our spending as a result of that, and where we are in the formula, it results in additional resources coming in. But then there are districts that are truly in significant declining enrollment, their property values are going up. So let's say you're a district that's surrounding lake property, your property values went up 10%, your student count went down 3%. That's a very bad combination in the state aid formula. And so even though there was like how many hundreds of millions put in, they're getting their report that might say minus 200,000, minus 500,000. And in their case, even though the revenue limit goes up zero, that gets made up by a property tax levy increase. And so those districts are going to be struggling to explain to their communities why they're saying we can't spend anything more, and taxes are going to go up $500,000 or $1 million or whatever. Because again, to the public, that doesn't make sense, right? You're saying you can't spend anything, then how are our taxes going up? As it relates to where we are with the third draft of the budget, at the budget committee meeting that's at 5:30, our recommendation administratively is to just table that discussion until we can see what the governor does. The governor has broader authority in the state of Wisconsin to do line item vetoes. And basically at this point, we're waiting to see what action the governor may or may not take based on what was sent to him.
And he has a time frame.
He has a time frame. And I think it's this week, right, Randy?
I think
From my
it's
understanding,
6
it's a
days.
number of days. I have the number 6 in my
I
head.
have 6 days in my
Yeah, and I
head,
think
and
it's
I don't
from
know.
when it landed on his desk, he has like 6, I think, business days. So I think it's this week. We'll at least find out where he's at.
So as all of this discussion relates to, I would say, probably the largest fiscal decision in front of the board for the next year is really what we're going to have Brian review in just a moment. The one thing I just want to state is, though, even though we're going to be requesting from the budget committee to table that until we can see what the governor does, we remain committed to the concept of all employee groups having pay increases by the first paycheck of the year. We do not want to see groups treated differently just because a state budget changed, as we went through our process. So we would like to see a teacher supplemental pay approval take place so that they can receive that increase in their first paycheck. We were looking to move that forward to the July board meeting to give us the administrative time in the HR department to do that. But we do feel like we have built in enough time that another week or two is something that we would be able to manage. The one thing in our situation that we can view as incredibly positive in the challenging state budget scenario is the operational referendum question that we asked the public for last November and received approval on. That was a 5-year window. Every year the board has the opportunity to look at that and make a decision as to, are we going to exercise our ability to use this 2.1 million or are we not? And some members of the public asked that question last fall, right? Well, what's going to happen if COVID goes away, or what's going to happen if your expenses related to this topic aren't going to be as significant? We said the board will have to look at the facts as they exist with our budget and make that decision next year. So that's what we're going to have to do, is look at the total facts of the budget picture once we know what the governor ends up doing, and the board will be in a position, and you will probably see an administrative recommendation from us to utilize the full $2.1 million for operational expenses. for the next fiscal year, which gives us an ability that I would say most school districts in Wisconsin will not have, which is an operational referendum available to us to be able to use for operational expenses. That puts us in a situation where no matter what it is that happens in the next week or so with the state budget, we have options available to us to look at for the teacher supplemental pay scenario and what has already been approved for the other employee groups. So as we talked, I think this came up last month, where I was saying that we do have several options available to us in our district that make this discussion one that we can have. Unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of districts in Wisconsin who are going to look at the same situation, and they're going to know their budget went up zero. They're going to know the federal funding has to be spent on specific purposes, and they are going to really struggle with how do we provide even a cost of living increase to our staff. So we actually have a positive situation sitting alongside the negative situation that currently exists for the state budget, which is why we're confident we can continue having these discussions. But we feel, Brian, Randy, and I feels like we have to be able to answer to the board, where exactly is the funding for this coming from? Is it coming from the state budget? Is it coming from us making a decision to maybe not pay our Fund 73 trust for a year? Is it coming from fully utilizing the operational referendum funds? But we feel like we need to see what the governor is going to do so that we can line this up with a funding source, and so that every board member will know when they are looking at what this committee recommends or what the board takes a look at, exactly how this all fits in together. And we just are probably a week away of being able to really do that. And so that's why our recommendation, at least on the budget piece, is to hold off until we can see what the governor does. But we do absolutely remain committed to wanting to move this forward. We just want to make sure we can answer questions about, does this now mean that administratively we're going to request using the entire 2.1 million? That's the likely outcome if the revenue limit formula remains at zero. So if we end up having a revenue limit of zero, that's going to be the likely revised version of the fourth budget, would be to fully utilize the 2.1 million in operational funds to allow us to continue moving forward with what we've been planning for the last couple months. I'll have Brian walk through the next part, because Brian did some calculations on various different scenarios and was going to walk through those. But I just wanted to share with you why we were at this point thinking about the concept of just holding off until we know what the governor is doing, and then being able to present a budget to the board so you fully understand what that picture looks like. And then that right now looks like it'll work very nicely with the timing on a decision with teachers. April would be too late, or I'm sorry, August would be too late. Brian's team would not be able to put that together in time. But a special board meeting, perhaps on July 19th or somewhere in that range, we will have the information that we need. We can then share it with the board members, and then you'll have the information you need. So Brian, I can kick it over to you to walk through the information you put together.
Thank you, Steve. Does my volume remain okay with everyone?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think Steve's point is one that obviously the big picture, where does this come from, is the part that we're awaiting further information on. The other part of the picture, what could it mean to us? What is the cost? That's the information that we have a much stronger handle on. And so just for reference sake, if someone could open up the underneath agenda item 5, the attachment listed are called compensation packages. That's the first thing that we had seen or shown related to this. And we had put in a placeholder within those documents or within those packages for our teaching staff when we put into effect the compensation increases for the other five employee groups. And so I just want to point out to you a couple of those numbers. And then Jim asked a great question in email today that I can answer by way of kind of showing you what the difference is. So if we've got that compensation packages attachment open, if we look on the top, across the top line, upper right-hand corner, of the first of the two sheets, it talks about teachers 1.23% CPI increase, $600 in points, and then non-teachers, other employee groups. It identifies what we did for compensation for those groups. And so these two numbers, we're only going to look at actually a couple of the numbers on this sheet. If we look on the far right, if we scroll down just a little bit, it talks about total additional dollars. On the far right there in bold, next to the teaching group, it talked about $527,862.85. That is an estimate based on who our teaching staff was at the beginning of May. And so actually it was a little bit even earlier than that, because at that point we knew that members of our teaching staff were going to retire. We knew that at some point some of our teachers were going to resign to go to other employment. But what we used was the information from those individuals to create that estimate. And as you look at that, the CPI, a dollar increase is accordingly based on the staffing that we had at that time. Benefits, because if we pay out more salary, we have to provide, we have some more benefits that are tied to that. The other dollar increase is supplemental pay or points. That's there, and then other dollars that go with that. And then the total number, again, that estimate was $527,862.85. And then again, it's 600 point cost. If we scroll down to the second sheet on the estimate, the second one is similar information, except for that top line now identifies that this is a $900 point increase or other dollar increase. And if you look to the right there, correspondingly, we go up a little bit more than $100,000 for total additional dollars in cost. Now, the reason I brought this up was just for the whole picture to be shown. These are both, as I mentioned, estimates. If we go to the second attachment, or excuse me, the first attachment, sorry, which is teacher supplemental pay scenarios, 7/2021. Now, Joan, getting to roundabout way to get to your question is why do these total cost numbers look different than the ones that were in the estimate? And there's two reasons. Reason number one is this number, this total cost number should say total salary cost. It does not include additional benefits, and I have that information for you based on the calculation of the total. Again, the total cost times the additional benefits. I can get us rounded to the $1,000 value on that. And so, as we look at those, and again, if people want to jot this down, or I will correct the spreadsheet. I apologize. I'm not all the best spreadsheets are Microsoft. Are in Microsoft, and two things are preventing me from accessing anything in Microsoft right now. One is our network, and two is my location. And so I will create a new spreadsheet that shows that information in writing, but I can give it to you verbally here. If we are looking at a $600 point decrease, the true total cost is going to be $529,000. Again, rounded to the thousand here. If we are looking at a $900 point increase, we are looking at $644,000. If we're looking at a $1,200 point increase, we're looking at $759,000. And if we are looking at a $1,500 point increase, we're looking at $874,000. The second part of the reason that those numbers are somewhat different is that these are a true costing of these supplemental increases. At this point, we know which teachers have retired and who they've been replaced by. We know, we know that new teachers into our district don't get a points increase. They are only given the CPI increase. So we know a position is going to, we know what the CPI cost is for even distribution for a new position. And that's why if you look in the column that says Calc Field CPI cost, that remains constant in all four of our costing scenarios here. That is a known cost based on the negotiations that the board took with the teaching association that we still need to formally ratify, potentially at the July 12th meeting, or if you wish to do both supplemental and base increases at the same time. If the board does decide to do an extra meeting, we could do it at that point. And then I guess we, as you can see, we're roughly going up $100,000 for every $300 in points that we give out, and then benefits are tagged to that number at about 15% of the total salary cost. Covered a lot of numbers there for you. I'm certainly willing and ready to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Was anybody able to calculate a percentage of total salary increase of the 1,200 or the 1,500? So originally the 600 was a 2.16 total increase and the 900 was a 2.63. Can we kind of estimate that it would go up another 0.5% so that the 1,200 would be 3.1, or is there, did anybody get a chance to do that?
If you I'm sorry, Joan, I forgot to calculate that, but if you stall for just a second, I could do a quick calculation on that.
That would be great.
Actually, the one thing I don't have in front of me to do that is can someone, or I can flip back, oh, darn it. I just need to see what the total salary number was that we were basing that off of last year. I know it's 21 million, but I can't remember the rest of that number.
I have it right here. 21,220,420.
So $1,200 in supplemental pay is 3.58%.
3.58.
3.58.
Okay.
And then let's see, 874. Could you give me that number again, Joan, please?
You want the
total salary.
From the 2021.
Yes.
21,220,420.
And then the $1,500 package would be 4.1 1-2%.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, would there be availability of funds for all of them, even the top?
So, yeah, that's it. So Judy's question is, what would be the possible availability of funds for the whole range of what it is that you're looking at right now? I would say that the biggest question is whether the governor is going to use their line item veto to do something to raise the revenue limit from 0 to some other number. Whether it's from 0 to 50 or 0 to 100, that is the big question, is whether the revenue limit formula itself and the ability for a district to spend some of the money that Joan referenced was in the article in the paper is going to be the big key. Where most of us in the school world are, of course, hoping for some ability with the governor's line item veto. So if the governor, as an example, somehow was able to change state equalization aid, that's not spendable. If somehow in the line item veto, he's able to change the revenue limit formula, or another example is the per pupil categorical aid that remained the same, but if somehow that is changed, it provides spendable funds for the district. So that's the main question schools are waiting to try to understand. The other thing in our case that makes the discussion challenging is we know we're going to receive funds under ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. We know the board has approved positions that are appropriate uses of federal funds. Examples are additional reading and math support for students. That is appropriate under the COVID funding because a portion of those funds are intended to be used for students who we're trying to catch back up any instructional loss they had. But at this point, we're not turning in our in-person hours until August. I'm sure it's going to take the DPIs some time to then figure all that out and then determine how much is going to be spread back out to the districts that are involved in this. And it's not every district in the state. It's a specific subset of districts who aren't receiving a minimum level of federal support. We're all competing, so to speak, for a pot of money based on how many hours we have. So we will receive some funding that will allow us to move positions that the board has already approved into federal funds. We do have the ability to use ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 over multiple fiscal years. So whatever we receive in those federal funds improves the picture as well. But the most immediate question is really, will the governor be able to do something to allow school districts to actually be able to spend some of that additional resources that are being directed towards schools? Once we know that, which we hope will happen this week or maybe early next week, it will be a more clear picture for us as far as the information that Brian presented and what scenarios might allow us to match up our resources with those different options. That's why when Randy and Brian and I were talking earlier today, it makes sense to temporarily table the discussion of the third draft of the budget and the teacher pay increase so we can present that to you together. So you feel like, first of all, we wouldn't want you to make a decision tonight to recommend something that's on the lower end because you're concerned about what may or may not be there for resources. And then we find out more funding becomes available. We just want you to have the picture, but we want Brian to be able to just make sure you can see the scope of it. And then we're hoping within the next week or so, we can then share with you what the options are aligned to that. So hopefully we will know really soon.
Thank you.
Have you identified funding that can go into Fund 10 from the retirements and the new staff, or are we still hiring? You know, you know what I mean, the
Yep.
differential between who we're hiring and who we lost.
Brian's office has developed a tracking process for that. I can't speak to exactly where they're at with updating that, but that is something that we are constantly tracking. Jenny Endress has completed that in the past, and that's something we can check with her to see where that's at. I don't know if she started doing it position by position or wanted to wait until all the teachers were hired. But yes, we will have that.
That money.
Yeah.
And you know, my personal feeling is I know why our classified and our custodial staff receive 4% and 3.77% raises. I mean, I respect that we needed to do something to be able to hire people in that category. But I'm uncomfortable with both the 900 and the 600 for our staff. I feel it's just too low for what we've asked them to do this year. But I also know we can't pay them when we don't have money. So, you know, I appreciate that we might need more additional information, because I would love to recommend 15 or at least 1,200 and get them closer, you know, the 3.5 to the 4%. That's kind of where I'm at with it all.
But you're not asking us to come up with it yet, to make a thought, make a
Initially,
recommendation.
when we set this meeting up before the legislative process had moved on to the governor and what ended up happening, our intentions absolutely were to present a governor approved third draft of the budget so you could take a look at it and know exactly what that looked like, along with asking for a recommendation that the two coincided with each other, and then bring it to the board meeting next Monday night. That was absolutely what we were intending to do. Obviously, when the 4.4 billion in additional resources was identified, most individuals in the school community thought that that meant the revenue limit would then be increasing, right? But it didn't. Additional 400+ million more went into school funding, but ended up becoming non-spendable to schools.
What does that mean when we've got it, but we don't have it?
Right, that's a really good question.
So where does it go?
It goes to
Property.
across the state. It's different.
Lowering
each-
property
in
taxes?
property taxes in general, but it's different because some communities, like Joan was referencing, actually are seeing a decline in funding under the state aid formula. When a district has a decline, that money still is in the pot of money and it's going somewhere else. And so districts that, let's say, are rapidly growing with a lower property value per student are seeing larger dollar increases. Districts that are seeing stable or decreasing enrollment with very large property tax or property value increases are seeing the opposite happen. So it's widely different across Wisconsin. That's why in the last several budget cycles, the legislators have, at least the prior legislators, had started to prefer this per pupil categorical aid, because in the end, it was distributed to all districts the same. Instead of being concerned about raising the revenue limit and putting money into the state equalization aid, their preference had been holding the revenue limit down, but putting the money into this other new form of money for schools. But that didn't happen this time. It went back to the state equalization aid formula, which I think there's going to be a lot of surprised individuals when they read the full statewide report saying, I thought we just put $400 million more into this. how did all of these districts end up with negative numbers? Well, they did because of where they were in the formula.
Yeah, Judy, the only way we get additional funds to spend towards our programs is if it goes one on the revenue cap for per pupil increase to the revenue cap, or a per pupil increase per the categorical aids. So we're not getting that in the current budget. The dollars are going into state, the equalization aid, which is all underneath the cap. So all that does is it reduces the amount that local property taxpayers pay because there's more money. It's that balancing piece underneath the revenue cap.
So if the governor doesn't line item and do anything and we're stuck with what we have, are you saying we have some sources with the referendum money to cover a
So
bad
what,
scenario?
yeah, so what we would have available to us is the public approved the operational referendum last November for a 5-year period of time. And operational referendum questions, once approved by the public, become a decision for the board to make. So the authority was from the public to you as a board to say you may spend up to $2.1 million above what the revenue limit formula says you could otherwise spend on operational expenses for the school district. So you as a board will be able to determine, are you going to approve a budget that uses that $2.1 million in year 2 of the 5 years of that program for operational expenses for the district? And so that will be a question that we were going to be posing anyways, no matter what the governor ended up doing or not doing, is what did we want to do with the allocation of the $2.1 million in total? We've temporarily placed some of the new positions there until we can find out if the federal funding will support them. But as a board, you do have an operational referendum question that is your ability to tap into in this fiscal year up to 2.1 million.
But so the governor is passing a 2-year budget. And if we use operational funding to pay our staff their raises this year, we will be forced next year into that same boat. Then we only have 2 more years left. We'll have to go to referendum to make that up unless we get a whole bunch of new people downtown.
So a very likely scenario, if the governor feels that he doesn't have the ability to line item veto and schools don't have spendable funds, but property taxes drop, is operational referendum questions are going to show up everywhere. Yep. School boards all over Wisconsin are going to say, we can't spend anything, but yet we want to provide our staff with a pay increase. We have a property tax decline, let's say in a community coming for $1 million. We would like to ask the public, instead of having, again, it couldn't happen this fall, but in general, in concept, it could happen next spring or the following fall, asking the public instead to support an operational referendum question to basically end up having local decisions in each community about whether or not those funds could be spent. But that's what a school board would likely have to do to be able to go to their public and say, we actually want to give, we want to add positions potentially if there's educational needs, if there's needs for facilities and maintenance, if there's an interest in providing cost of living pay increases. It will result in school boards having to look at the, again, operational referendum question to be able to allow them to spend above the revenue limit formula. And I would expect that many, many school boards are going to be looking at that route if the revenue limit ends up being 0. So I think it's going to actually become very common.
So I'm not sure where we're at with our discussion.
we're waiting, right? Till we hear from,
I think the big thing is, does anybody have any questions for Brian on the information he put in, or do you feel like you would like any other information, or are you feeling like you have what you need and then we just need to figure out the funding piece?
Well, I would love to see a spreadsheet like the one you did for the 600 and the 900 with the total budget cost to the raises for the 1,200 and the 1,500 with accurate numbers.
Absolutely, yeah. And those will be, as I said, once I can get access to the network and or to my computer where I've got the, I'll be able to create those spreadsheets and put those in for you folks to have that viewable by everyone.
So then that means we'll need to meet again. Well, we have a meeting on Monday. I guess we can talk about it on Monday.
I mean, one of the things I think that we discussed when Steve, Brian and I did was, do we solely request a special meeting of the board, which we could talk about on Monday, and then we bring all of that for the whole board to see at the same meeting. And the only agenda items would be their draft of the budget and this.
That's probably a good
And
idea.
that way everybody sees it, everybody hears it, and we can kind of go from there.
And what we're looking to tap into is basically the difference between our draft budget and wherever we end up.
Mhm.
So the 126, 240. Okay.
okay. All right,
Yeah,
we're set with that then?
we just have the next one more agenda item too.
Yeah, we have the discussion of modifying the guidelines for having phone.
Yeah, and I'm just bouncing back and forth, keeping up with you guys on my computer here. And so the reason for this coming in front of you is you obviously as a board just approved or in June did a final approval of all the employee handbooks. And currently there isn't any language in our handbooks or in any policy that identify an expectation of having our head custodians and maintenance workers be accessible by phone outside of their work hours. And so this is totally centered on the issue of emergency callbacks. And what we're really talking about when we talk about emergency callbacks, I give you the two most recent examples. We had a sump pump fail at the high school this school year, within this school year, and had challenges getting in touch with individuals to come in and get that situation resolved. And then the other one obviously is centered around snow, and calling people back to take care of or making sure that something like that is being taken care of. And then in the case of a head custodian, it really also becomes a matter of that person being available to their evening crew if an emergency were to come up. Typically our head custodians are ending their work days around 3 p.m. and our evening custodians are extending to 11 or 12 p.m. 11 p.m. or 12 a.m. And if they were to run into an emergency and need to get in touch with someone, that's what we're looking for, to be able to get in touch with them. And so currently, both head custodians and maintenance workers are provided smartphones. They're provided a school funded smartphone, but there isn't any allowance for them to use it for personal use. And so I think to a person, they all have their own personal phone as well. So we're giving them one phone for free. They've got another one that they're paying for on their own. What this would allow is basically mirrored language so that head custodians and maintenance workers could use their phones for personal use, not have to pay for their own personal phone, just like we asked our administrators and admin support group, we'll give you a phone as a school district, but you've got to have it with you and at all times and be able to take a call.
That seems reasonable.
Is there any feedback from the head custodians and maintenance workers that they'd want that or not want it?
Well, I guess we've not asked that question directly. Do you want to be asked to carry your phone with you at all times? I would say that there's some anecdotal evidence that would say that some prefer not to have that because they like to turn off their phone when they walk away from the building. But the issue that comes in then is they're not available when they're needed.
Yeah.
And, that's, John and I talked about this, quite a bit. And we thought in return, obviously asking someone to have their phone with them, we're asking something of them. However, if we then give them something to say, hey, in return for having this phone with you, you can say to yourself, whatever it is that your personal phone plan costs you, and whether that's, depending on what their phone plan is, $60 to, $100+ a month, there's a value in it for them as well. And so it's, a trade-off that we're asking something, but we're trying to give something as well.
Brian, do they get any choice in the phone?
Yes, they typically have some choice. I don't know that they have the full choice that administrators and admin support are given, but they do have they are given options, and they are upgraded. Their phones are upgraded as upgraded phones become available.
There's a list that we received that Steve's office puts out that articulates types of phones that you can choose from, and then the associated costs to those. So there's some things that would be at the business office expense, and it gives you a kind of an options to choose from.
All of our smartphones and plans are through the state of Wisconsin contract. So we jump on what the state has available to them, and obviously pretty big bargaining power. And it's through US Cellular. So we have the same plan that UW employees would have or state employees would have. So we have actually really good prices. And when folks have come in and said, hey, we want to offer you cell service, when we say, well, this is what we have through the state contract, I mean, you just can't compete with that.
Yeah.
So we are on the lower end of the cost spectrum with what we're paying for both the devices and the use, just because we're paying for this particular expenditure, we're jumping on the state contract and paying those rates.
So do you want a recommendation that we approve this from this committee?
Yes.
Yeah, a motion would be appropriate if you supported it to have us adjust and handbook to include this language.
Yeah, motion to approve this language for put it in the handbook.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So moved. Any other topics?
Excuse me. That was everything we had for this evening's agenda.
Okay.
Okay,
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
so moved.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
One down
Thank
and
you.
2 to go.